The title of Dr. Anthony Taylor's presentation is Working with Nature, Ecological Forestry as a Path Towards the Long-Term Health of the Wabanaki Forest. During his presentation, Dr. Taylor will discuss how ecological forestry has gained popularity in recent years, with multiple studies showing its benefits towards reversing degradation, restoring biodiversity, and resiliency to climate change. Still, adoption of ecological forestry across the Wabanaki Forest has been slow, in part due to mixed interpretations of what it is and also because of constraints on its operationalization. It's a mouthful. The objective of Dr. Taylor's presentation is to take a step back and review the core principles of ecological forestry, including strategies for its implementation, known limitations, and potential future research needs. This webinar is being recorded, and it is taking place in the traditional homeland of the Wolastoqiyik, the Mi'kmaq, and the Pescamaquoddy, 3 of the 5 nations of the Wabanaki Confederacy. We recognize the inherent and constitutional rights of Indigenous and Métis people to self-determination and self-government. This includes their rights to maintain and practice their customs and cultures, spiritual traditions, language, social and legal systems, traditional political structures, deep enduring relationships with waterways and all that exists in, on, and above their homelands. For webinar etiquette, everyone is encouraged to participate. Please be polite and respectful when engaging with the presenter. The format of the webinar will be Dr. Taylor's presentation and then an opportunity for questions. Please prepare any questions for the session in writing using the Q&A feature. We will address questions when the Q&A starts. Please do stay connected and involved. Sign up for our e-newsletter, explore CCNB membership, and more. We want to see a ban on the use of glyphosate on the Crown Forest, and along with Stop Spraying New Brunswick, we have a letter writing campaign you can sign. In addition, we have a letter writing campaign that we're sharing with CPAWS New Brunswick, and like other conservation organizations, we are calling for strong protected areas in New Brunswick. The government has committed to protecting 15% of the province for nature. And the letter addressed to the Minister of Natural Resources and the Premier lets them know they're counting on them to follow through this year with strong permanent legal protections by creating new protected areas. It's a quick way to show your support for nature protection in New Brunswick. And these QR codes, of course, are to the side of the content that they apply to. To help us plan for future webinars, we will be sending a brief follow-up survey that we hope you can complete. And now, with not too much further ado, I am delighted to be introducing Dr. Anthony Taylor. He is an associate professor of forest management at the University of New Brunswick and a registered professional forester. His research focuses on the effects of management strategies on conservation, forest carbon, adaptation to climate change, and resource economics. Dr. Taylor holds a BSc in Environmental Science from Memorial University of Newfoundland and a master's and PhD in forestry from Lakehead University, Thunder Bay, Ontario. I'm going to now hand this off to you.
Great.
Give me a minute.
Thank you, Marika.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to stop sharing my video for a second first.
Marika, the slides aren't there. Oh, there we go.
Okay, can you see my opening slide, Marika?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, perfect. And you can hear me well?
Very well.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining today. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to be able to speak to a large crowd, especially on this topic. And so, as Marika was saying, that the title of my presentation today is Working with Nature, Ecological Forestry as a Path Towards the Long-Term Health of the Wabanaki Forest. So today's focus is on ecological forestry. And what I'd like to do for this talk today is, well, first I'd like to begin with why is this topic still so important and inciting, in fact? And then after talking about its importance and increasing relevance in this day and age, I wanted to take a step back and reevaluate, well, what is it that we mean exactly when we're talking about ecological forestry? I think it's good to do that once in a while, just to recapture our bearing in terms of what we're talking about. Then I want to move into, well, how does it work exactly, at least theoretically? And how are we doing at this currently in the Wabanaki Forest? And then I want to finish off then with discussing some of the future challenges in terms of the implementation and operationalization of ecological forestry. So, why is it so important and exciting for that matter, this topic of ecological forestry? I mean, I find it quite exciting when I think about the possibilities with this. Well, there's a few reasons for this. One of the reasons is that I fully believe that ecological forestry has the potential to return the character of the Wabanaki Forest to something closer to what it was pre-colonial times. And in doing so, it has the potential to restore critical habitat and enhance biodiversity across the region. In addition to that, it also has the potential to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And in doing so, these things, it also still has the potential to provide multiple goods and services, including timber. In fact, I go so far to say is that ecological forestry, you could have your cake and eat it too, or at least pretty close, anyways. The topic I
Dr.
wanted to drill
Taylor.
into, yes,
Oh, sorry to interrupt. I just wondered, did you want your camera on or off? Because it is currently off.
yeah, off. Is that okay?
Okay, sure.
Yeah,
Apologies for the interruption.
I had no problem. Um, I think that this philosophy does have the potential for you can have your cake and eat it too. But what I'd like to drill into a little bit deeper here first is, well, its potential to mitigate and adapt to climate change, which is something closer to my own line of research. So let's start with mitigation. Now, I'm going to zoom out sort of a global context here to begin with. So over the past 10,000 years, since the end of the last ice age, we've lost about a third of the forest globally, about 2 billion hectares. So at 10,000 years ago, it was the end of the ice age, and we were at maximum forest extent globally. It was estimated to have been about 6 billion hectares of forest around the planet. And since that time, we've lost 2 billion hectares, largely due to the development of agriculture and other human infrastructure. Now, 2 billion hectares, just to put that number into context, that's an area about twice the size of Canada. So we're not talking about a little bit of forest here, 2 billion hectares. Deforestation continues today, and it currently continues at a rate of about 5 million hectares per year. And to put that number into context, that's a size of forest, well, a little bit bigger than the size of the forest of Nova Scotia. So we have this rate of forest deforestation continuing on today. Now, on top of that, with our existing forests that are here, scientists estimate that 60 to 80% of those forests are considered degraded. Now, degraded can be a contentious word, and different people have different definitions of what degraded means, but I guess the long and short of it is forests that could be better than what they are, sort of thing. So because of this loss of forests and this degradation of forests, this, as scientists estimate, this equates to about 350 billion tons of carbon that have been lost from our global forest over the past 10,000 years that are now either resides in the atmosphere or in the oceans. Now, that's a lot of bad news to start off with right away, but there is hope. First and foremost, we should be aiming to stop deforestation, full stop. That's the first thing we should be considering and doing. The second thing is that we should be looking into some of these areas that have the potential for afforestation in terms of restoring lands that were previously forested to forest once again. But thirdly, and a little closer to home, is that there's also the potential to regain some of this carbon back through better forest management. In fact, scientists have shown that through conservation and this thing called ecological forestry, it has the potential to sequester back about 125 billion tons of that 350 billion tons that we've lost. So 125 billion tons we could gain back globally if through conservation efforts and better forest management or ecological forestry. To put that number into context, 125 billion tons, that's equivalent to about, well, humanity emits around 10 billion tons of carbon per year. So that's over 10 years worth of global emissions. So that's nothing to snuff at. And even Canada as a country can contribute to this. It's estimated that through conservation and ecological forestry, Canada could gain back about 8 billion tons of carbon into its forest. So it has a lot of mitigation potential, ecological forestry, but it also has potential on the adaptation to climate change side of things. Since 2023, Nova Scotia has experienced two of its worst wildfire years in nearly a century. I guess you could say that for Canada as a whole. Now, it's well-known fact, there's lots of science to support this, that forest lands managed towards boreal conifer dominance are at greater risk of burning. And with climate change, warming temperatures, and potentially drier temperatures, there's that increasing risk of wildfire into the future. Now, conservation and ecological forestry have the potential to help offset this risk by promoting tree species diversity. And when I say tree species diversity, I mean more hardwoods across the landscape. And this has a double benefit. Not only is it helping to reduce the risk of wildfire into the future with a changing climate, but also by promoting more of these warmer adapted hardwood species, it may help to maintain future productivity and growth of our forests into the future as colder adapted boreal conifers become less suited to warmer climate. So then what is this magical thing that I've been talking about, ecological forestry? Well, I thought instead of defining what it is right away, I'd first define, well, what it is not. So in terms of what it's not sustained yield forestry. And I would know because I grew up working in sustained yield forestry for most of my life. And I know it quite well, but I'm not the only one. In fact, many people across the world, in North America, have grown up in using and relied on the system of sustained yield forestry. In fact, it's been the predominant system of forest management in North America for the past century. But what is sustained yield forestry? Well, just a little bit of historical context. Sustained yield forestry is an idea that was largely imported from Europe about 125, 130 years ago by a number of different foresters. But one person that I'll point out here is a German forester named Bernard Verneau. Now, Bernard Verneau, he migrated to the US around the 1880s, 1890s. He's from Prussia. He was supposed to stay at home and look after the family forest estate, but he fell in love with an American girl at college and ended up following her back to America. And he actually couldn't find work towards the beginning of his immigration to the U.S. because at that time there wasn't a lot of work for a scientifically trained forester, which was something more in Europe at the time. But after a while, he did find work. And not only did he find work, Bernard had a strong influence on the direction of forest management in North America moving forward. He's largely accredited to introducing something to North America we call the forest or the normal forest concept or the fully regulated forest concept. And this is a concept of forest management that developed in Europe during and shortly after the Industrial Revolution in Europe, where they deforested and degraded a lot of their forest. And this normal forest concept, it was a way to systematically increase the productive capacity of the forest in Europe. And so they brought this idea here to North America, and the idea behind it was to help tame or I guess civilize the wild forest of North America at the time. It was a way of creating a more orderly or systematic way of managing the forest and to dividing it up into a set of age classes, with the oldest age class corresponding to the commercial rotation age that was desired. This model of forestry, the normal forest or the sustained yield forestry concept, it really emphasized the commercial production of timber through the use of intensive silviculture and this forest management strategy, the normal forest. Now, it really began to gain dominance in Canada right around the 1930s and into World War II, but specifically after World War II during the post-war housing boom and mechanization of forestry. Indeed, this post-war housing boom can't be understated. On the bottom here, I've provided a chart, and this is just for the US, and this red line here is showing housing starts in the US from the 1890s up until the present time. And if you follow this chart through time, shortly after World War II, we have a boom in housing. Then there's the Great Depression, and housing starts decrease. They start to increase again. Then the U.S. gets involved with World War II, and then slowly, shortly after World War II, we see a substantial increase in the amount of housing starts in the U.S. And this demand for wood really drove the increase in demand for lumber across North America and helped propel this concept of sustained yield forestry in North America. It was also helped along by evolution of technology and the mechanization of forestry. In fact, World War II also contributed significantly to technologies like aerial surveillance for building inventories, hydraulics, for instance, and the use of processors. This little picture that I put up here is a picture of a early John Deere 730, an early form of harvester that used shear heads that actually my father-in-law helped test pilot at one time in Western Canada back in the early 1970s. So shortly after World War II, sustained yield forestry was in full boom and things were developing and growing very rapidly. And in fact, here in the Maritimes, the number of pulp mills tripled during this time from World War II up until the 1970s and 80s, peaking around 13 mills in the 1970s. The number of sawmills actually decreased somewhat, but they increased in size in terms of their productivity to somewhere around 150 to 200 mills. Coinciding with this, the annual allowable cut on Crown land also tripled during this time. So it was a substantial and significant time in terms of the growth and production of sustained yield forestry across North America. Now, also coinciding with this time, during the 1950s and getting into the 1960s, we had substantial growth in the middle class of North America. And in fact, I was listening to an interesting podcast the other day talking about uh, points in time where the inequality gap between the poorest and the richest was the least. And there's 2 points in time over the past 1,000 years this historical economist was mentioning, and he was talking about how the 1950s, the inequality gap was reduced to one of its smallest in history. That and also following the bubonic plague or the Black Death during the medieval period. During those 2 periods of time is when you had this smallest gap in inequality. And so this really stands out in 20th century history, this growth of the middle class. So with this growth of the middle class also came a growth with wealth and time for this class of people. And this led to more time for things like recreation or leisure in the forest. And this led people to using the forest for other things other than timber production. So people were beginning to recognize that the forest served a lot of other purposes. Also, during this time in the 1960s and into the 1970s, there was increasing awareness that the world population was growing substantially. I'm always astounded when I look at this graph here of the world's population. This is showing world population back 2000 BCE up until the present time. And as you can see, throughout most of humanity, the world's population was less than 500 million people until you get into the late 1800s, until all of a sudden the population explodes. And in the 1960s, the population had increased to around 3 billion people. Today, we sit at 8.2 billion people. So this is an astonishing amount of growth. And this growth in the world's population really began to instill upon people how limited our natural resources were and the strain they were under. And in fact, it was really encapsulated in this photo from Bill Anders took in 1968, showing just the finite nature of our planet. So these things combined sort of coalesced in the 1960s and 70s. Oh, yes. And also worth mentioning, too, that tomorrow is Earth Day, and it also started in 1970 as a consequence of these things that we're talking about. These things led to a change in how we looked at sustained yield forestry. In fact, recognition that our forests provide other resources was beginning to be codified in law. I just put a couple pieces of legislation up here as examples of that from 1960 and 1975. So there was increasing amounts of legislation being devoted to recognizing these other uses and protecting our forest lands. And so this then brought about, I guess, a different flavor of sustained yield forestry, something today we call multi-use sustained yield forestry, which sought to broaden the base of forest uses and protections. Now, the thing with multi-use sustained yield forestry, however, while it did provide protection and recognition of these other uses, timber production, though, was still top priority under the system of multi-use sustained yield forestry. And it's worth mentioning that this is today still the predominant form of forest management used in North America. Other values under the system, things such as biodiversity, recreation, or well-being, where while they were being accounted for, they were still largely viewed as constraints on wood production. And this made some people, I guess, not so happy with the situation. Still, as the 1980s carried on, some large environmental issues, though, were growing in awareness and importance still. And despite the environmental awareness that grew out of the 1960s and 70s, biodiversity is still being lost at expansive rates. And there was this other topic now that was becoming more to the forefront in the 1980s called climate change. And it was increasingly being recognized that these weren't just issues that any one country could tackle on their own, but they required a real international approach. And I would say a turning point in our history in terms of recognizing the international importance of these large environmental issues really took place at a United Nations meeting held in Brazil in 1992 called Earth Summit, which I'm sure that perhaps there's some people on the call today who were there or remember this or participated one way or another. But at this large United Nations meeting, countries were brought together to come up with ways of tackling these important global issues, including biodiversity loss and climate change. And it's at these meetings where we ended up with things like the Convention on Biological Diversity, which today is the convention responsible for instance, for the 30% protection by 2030, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the origins of the IPCC and much of our awareness and predictions of climate change. Following this significant turning point, though, there began to be viewed different ways of looking at forestry again. Things that perhaps were more on the fringe in the past were starting to come to the forefront. A new style of forestry, for instance, something some people termed new forestry, new wave forestry, alternative forestry, other terms such as continuous cover forestry, regenerative forestry, or ecosystem-based forestry. These were different ways, different paradigms of looking at how we conducted forestry that perhaps were more on the fringe in the past, but now they were making their way to the forefront. And one thing they all had in common was the importance of maintaining ecological integrity. And today, I like to term this as ecological forestry. And ecological forestry, it's the idea of it's been around for some time. And this is an example of a paper published by Dr. Stephen Spurr, who published the first forest ecology textbook in North America. And he actually coined this phrase, ecological forestry, back in 1942. And I'm sure he was considered quite fringe at the time for discussing it in this context. But in this early paper published in the Journal of Forestry, he talks about this idea of ecological forestry and how silvicultural treatment should follow nature as far as possible. And in fact, if you read this paper, you see a strong emphasis on how nature, specifically natural disturbances, should be guiding how we do forest management. Today, ecological forestry, it can be defined as a model of forestry that emphasizes the maintenance of natural ecological conditions, through which or under which the sustainable provision of goods and services to meet the needs of society is achieved. In other words, nature first, and then derive the goods and services that we need. And in fact, this whole concept of nature first and only taking what you need is not new by any means. Uh, Native people in North America have been recognizing this and practicing this for millennia. So now that we define what ecological forestry is, how does it work? Or how does it supposed to work? Well, as Dr. Stephen Spurr talked about in his paper, at the core of ecological forestry is the idea of emulating natural disturbances. So what's this connection then between ecological forestry and natural disturbance? Well, in that definition of ecological forestry, I said it was a model of forestry that emphasizes the maintenance of natural ecological conditions. Now, in nature, natural ecological conditions or natural ecosystem structure and function is largely regulated by two broad drivers. The abiotic environment, for instance, if I was hiking at the bottom of this hill and making my way to the top of this mountain, as I walked through to the top of the mountain, I would encounter all sorts of different structure and function of ecosystems. And a lot of that is driven by the climate and the underlying physiography and soils. And so the abiotic environment has a large control over the structure and function of ecosystems, of forest ecosystems. The other major driver here is disturbance. Disturbance has the potential to reset or redirect the direction of succession and significantly impact the structure and function of an ecosystem. As kind of a fun but serious example of this, some of you might recognize this mountain from the Northeast US. If not, this is Mount St. Helens in Washington. And if you were to take a, let's just say you're in your canoe and you stop by the shore, if you're going to take a walk from the shore from Spirit Lake up to the top of Mount St. Helens, again, you would experience significant changes in the structure and function of ecosystems, and that's largely driven by the climate and physiography of there, the abiotic environment. However, as some of you might remember, in May of 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted into what was the biggest volcanic explosion in American history. And shortly after that happened, the mountain looked like this. And this represents a substantial disturbance of the landscape. And as you can see by looking at these two pictures of the same mountain, following that explosion, it significantly impacted the structure and function of the ecosystem surrounding that mountain. Now, this is a bit of an extreme example, but it's an example of how the abiotic environment influences the structure and function of forests, but also how disturbance did. This little picture here is a picture of a forest about 20 to 30 kilometers away from that explosion of Mount St. Helens. And look how flat that forest is, just demonstrating the power of that explosion when it occurred. Now, when it comes to natural disturbance emulation and forest management, there's not a lot we can do about the abiotic environment as such in terms of the climate and the physiography, but there's a lot that we can do in terms of how we disturb things. Natural ecological conditions are more likely to be achieved by designing forest management strategies and silvicultural systems that emulate natural disturbances. And the basis for this, or the reason for this, is something called the coarse filter hypothesis. And the coarse filter hypothesis in ecology, it suggests that by using natural disturbance as a template for forest management and silviculture, one will, by default, create and maintain the types of habitats that would have formed naturally in the past, and in doing so, conserve most native species that have adapted to those habitats. And so we have this powerful potential mechanism at our disposal here in terms of emulating natural disturbance that may enable us to use the forest for timber production, but while also, though, conserving and producing the types of habitat that will protect biodiversity. Now, to do this successfully, though, requires two key pieces of information. The first one being we need knowledge of our natural disturbance regimes, since these are the things that we're going to use to guide our forest management, that we're going to emulate. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, well, how well can we actually emulate these natural disturbances? Do we even have the capacity or ability to emulate them, to copy them well, in terms of using them as a guide? So these are the two key pieces of the puzzle. In terms of knowledge of natural disturbances, well, there's been a fair bit of work in this region in the Wabanaki Forest on the natural disturbance regimes. So on this slide here, I've just put up an example of some of the many things that disturb our forest. For instance, if I scroll down through this list, here I listed, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but a number of insects and diseases that contribute to disturbing our forest on an annual basis, or other types of disturbances, things like ice storms, droughts, floods, extreme temperatures like late spring frost, for instance, landslides, or even the actions of some of the critters that exist in our forest, such as mammals, beavers being a good one. So we have a lot of things impacting our forests. But when you look back and study the effect of disturbances historically on our forest, the three things that affect and disturb the forest the most in our region would be wind, fire, and spruce budworm. And we call these things the big three. And because historically they're responsible for probably more than 80% of tree mortality that occurs within our forests naturally. Just to put that into context, as an example, just in one evening, a hurricane making its way across Nova Scotia, such as Hurricane Juan in 2003, kills more trees than 50 years worth of spruce beetle damage. So when you have something like a hurricane occur, it really has a major impact on our forests. So we have all these things impacting our forests, including the big three here. And people have been studying these things and how they affect our forests, including myself. And through that work, we've been able to derive, I guess, or calculate um, the regime or the frequency and severity of how often these things occur. So when considering all those natural disturbances, when they occur either as high severity disturbances, moderate severity disturbances, or low severity disturbances. And what I mean by that is that if you have a hurricane, for instance, go through and pass over the provinces here in this region, when a hurricane does occur, it's not all high severity disturbance. There are some areas that are highly severe where you have greater than 60% mortality, but you also have many areas that are moderately disturbed, and a lot of areas that are only experience low severity disturbance, maybe 5 to 30% mortality. And the same goes for wildfire when it occurs, or things like spruce budworm, maybe to different proportions, but they all result in high, moderate, and low severity disturbance. Now, studying past disturbances, we're also able to reconstruct not only the different severities, but how often do these things occur? What is their frequency or return interval, we call it? When we combine all the natural disturbances that impact our region and look at that historical data, what we find is that historically, high severity disturbances have a return interval of about 300 years. And what that means is that if I was to stand out in the forest and let's just say that a high severity disturbance passed through, whether it was a fire or a windstorm, and it disturbed more than 60% of the trees that were there, on average, it'd be another 300 years before that site would experience that same high severity disturbance again. Now, this is an average, and sometimes it's a bit sooner than that, sometimes it's later than that, but on average, 300 years. Now, disturbances are periodic and they don't always happen evenly every year. But for management purposes, we take that number and we calculate something called the mean annual disturbance rate. And what the mean annual disturbance rate means that given this frequency of high severity disturbances occurring on an annual basis, then how much area would be disturbed? And so in terms of high severity natural disturbances in our region, the mean annual disturbance rate is approximately 0.33%. So if you annualize it, 0.33% of the area is disturbed by high severity disturbance every year. Historically, this is pre-European colonization. If I look at low severity disturbance, for instance, so disturbances where only 5 to 30% mortality occurs, the return interval is much shorter, 50 years. So if you were standing in that same spot over the course of a 50-year period, you would expect to see another one of these low severity disturbances go through, which makes sense. A low severity disturbance could include something like a few trees either blowing over or dying due to some pathogen or insect. And the mean annual disturbance rate calculated for a 50-year return interval is 2%. So that means that as every year passes, approximately 2% of the landscape is impacted by low severity disturbance. So our knowledge of natural disturbance regimes in the region is growing. So we have some of that to help with this puzzle of implementing ecological forestry. What about our ability to emulate these natural disturbances? Now, to tackle this question, you have to look at it from two principal scales in forestry, the stand level and the landscape level. Stands being, well, delineated here in this example, all these polygons, but stands being the basic operating units of forestry. And how we tend and regenerate and play with stands is largely the domain of silviculture as a discipline. But we also have to look at it from the landscape level. And in forestry, a landscape is considered a collection of forest stands, which we manage. And the management of a landscape is largely the domain of forest management. And this differentiation of these two things, it's important. It's important for the success of this. So forest management is not the same thing as silviculture. I just want to make that point. Forest management has to do with the practice of regulating and scheduling silviculture and other activities on the landscape. Silviculture is the practice of regenerating and tending forest stands. The way I like to look at it as a forest manager, we have a toolbox of silviculture, and our silvicultural toolbox is full of all sorts of different silvicultural treatments that we could apply. The role of forest management is to figure when and where should we be applying these silvicultural treatments in order to achieve our landscape objectives, where silviculture is focused purely on what are the different treatments and how do they work and how can we use them to manipulate individual forest stands. So when it comes to silviculture or the stand level, well, we actually have quite a few tools in our silvicultural toolbox already to help us emulate natural disturbance. For instance, for high severity disturbances, if that's something we wanted to emulate, there's a whole family of clear cut type treatments, clear cutting with retention, which is important, that are at our disposal to use. Or if we're looking to emulate more of the moderate severity disturbances, well, again, there's a whole family of different shelter wood type treatments available at our disposal, such as gap shelter wood or irregular shelter wood or different types of shelter wood. Or if our thing is more emulating low severity disturbances, well, then this brings in my favorite, selection management. And again, there are different varieties of selection management that can be used to emulate low severity disturbances. And in fact, I'd say actually out of the stand level silviculture versus landscape forest management, stand level silviculture, in terms of emulating natural disturbance, has probably received the most attention in research. In fact, it's developed its own name, ecological silviculture. So there's been quite a bit of work done on this topic already. And in fact, a great resource locally that discusses this is the Nova Scotia Silvicultural Guide to the Ecological Matrix. I think it's probably one of the best resources in the region that describes these different silvicultural treatments and how they can be applied to emulate natural disturbance. So quite a bit of good work has been done here already in terms of filling up our silvicultural toolbox. Where things get a bit more murky and where I think there's more work to be done is on the forest management landscape level. So what I mean by that is, okay, I've already showed you that we have some knowledge of natural disturbances, high severity, moderate severity, and low severity, and we've determined approximate mean annual disturbance rates for these different severity disturbances in terms of how frequently they occur. So now let's compare that to, well, what we're doing today in the region in terms of how we manage our forest. Just as an exercise a while back, I went on to Canada's National Forestry Database, which is open to the public, and anyone can go on and look at this data. And I wanted to look at, well, average harvest rates for the past 10 years for our region. And so these are what I calculated based on the Canada's National Forestry Database. So in this table, and I want to spend some time in this table because this is important. So in this table here, we have each of our three maritime provinces that make up a lot of the Wabanaki Forest. So New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI. And I also have the area of forests within each province. So for instance, let's just start with New Brunswick. So New Brunswick has about 6 million hectares of forest. Now, over the past 10 years, this is the data that I was using, I was able to determine what is the average annual area harvested within New Brunswick. So in New Brunswick, on average, over the past 10 years, we harvest around 75,900 hectares of area. That's how much area is harvested each year on average over the past 10 years. Now, out of that total area harvested here, what proportion would be something like clear cutting? So clear cutting makes up 59,673 hectares of that total area, which is approximately 79% of the total area harvested is clear cut harvesting. So 59,000 hectares per year clear cut harvested. Now, if we were to look at that in terms of mean annual disturbance rate, so out of our total forested area in New Brunswick, and this is how much is clear cut harvested, which would be considered a high severity disturbance, the mean annual disturbance rate for that is 0.98% per year. So what that means that close to 1% of the forest of New Brunswick are clear cut harvested each year. Now, just to compare, the area that's partial cut harvested, which is the last column over here, there's about 16,300 hectares that are partial cut each year. And that makes up 21% of the overall harvested area. Or in terms of mean annual disturbance rate and partial cutting, well, there's a variety of methods within this partial cutting group I have here, but they would fall within the moderate to low severity disturbance. But the mean annual disturbance rate for partial cutting would equate to 0.27% per year. So in New Brunswick, for clear cut harvesting, which is a high severity disturbance, we're currently disturbing the forest at a 0.98% or close to 1% per year. Now, if I go back and look at our natural disturbance data and what we calculated in terms of, well, how often historically does high severity natural disturbance occur? Well, it has a mean annual disturbance rate of 0.33% per year. So the rate at which we're conducting high severity human caused disturbance, clear cut in this case, is 3 times what we've determined that would have occurred from natural disturbances historically. Now, if I go down into Nova Scotia here, so Nova Scotia is a bit smaller forested area, 4.2 million hectares. Over the past 10 years, on average, each year in Nova Scotia, they harvest around 29,600 hectares. Out of that, 22,927 hectares is clear cut, 6,600 hectares is partial cut. So in terms of the clear cut harvesting, out of the total area harvested, 77% is clear cut harvested and 23% is partial cut harvested. Now, this is an average for the past 10 years. Over the past 10 years, Nova Scotia has started to implement ecological forestry. So this number now has been dropping, but this is an average from the past 10 years. And so that represents that in terms of clear cut harvesting, high severity disturbance, the mean annual disturbance rate is 0.54%. So every year, 0.54% of the forest in Nova Scotia is clear cut harvested, representing that high severity. And only 0.16% is a moderate to low severity disturbance or partial cutting. Lastly, for PEI, a much smaller forest. Overall, 2,600 hectares of area harvested each year. 2,600 hectares of that is clear cut harvesting. So 98% overall of the harvesting that takes place there is clear cut harvesting, and only a small proportion being a form of partial cutting. When you add these up for the 3 provinces and look at the Maritimes as a whole, which make up much of the Wabanaki Forest, every year, on average, over the past 10 years, about 108,236 hectares of area is harvested. 85,215 hectares of that is clear cut harvesting, which means that 79%, close to 80% of the harvesting that takes place is clear cut, high severity disturbance. And only 23,000 hectares, or 21%, is partial cutting, which would more coincide with the moderate to low severity disturbances. So what the take-home message from this table here is that if we were to attempt to emulate natural disturbances more, implement ecological forestry more broadly across the region, then currently our forest management regime is out of whack with what we know about the natural disturbance regime for the region. And in particular, historically, high severity natural disturbances would have a mean annual disturbance rate of 0.33%. When we look at the region as a whole right now, clear cut harvesting, which would represent human caused high severity disturbance, is currently at 0.8% per year. So it's more than twice the amount that would occur naturally. And so this is an important point. So then this now naturally leads into, well, what are our future challenges then in terms of implementing ecological forestry here in the Wabanaki Forest? Well, I'd say one of the first challenges that we need to undertake is that while we've made strides in terms of our understanding of natural disturbances in this region, there's still a lot of work to be done. The values that I showed you here today for the Wabanaki Forest as a whole are based on our best estimates of what we think happens historically. But for those of us who study this, we also know that these natural disturbance rates, they also vary across the region. So just as an example, if I look at the provinces of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, they can be divided up into ecoregions, an ecological classification system for here. And we know that across these ecoregions, uh, rates of natural disturbances vary. In some areas, high severity disturbance might be more, and some areas, high severity disturbance could be less. And the same goes for moderate and low severity disturbance. So one of the challenges is to continue to study and to better understand and come up with a more precise understanding of what are the natural disturbance regimes at the ecoregion level across this region. And this will only help enable us to provide a better guide for us to emulate in terms of natural disturbances. One of the other challenges is while our silvicultural toolbox is full of things, there's still a lot of fine tuning that needs to be done to those silvicultural tools. So just as an example, for instance, if we were to develop a silvicultural prescription to emulate um, post wildfire conditions, is clear cutting just enough? Or should other treatments in addition to that be considered, such as, for instance, maybe prescribed burning? So these are the kind of questions that need to be asked and looked into in terms of how well can we actually emulate these things from a silvicultural point of view. Or let's just take in Nova Scotia, where they've been doing much more partial cutting now, because there's been ecological forestry being implemented on crown lands there. I know when Hurricane Fiona went through a couple of years ago, it really impacted a lot of the partial cutting. And so there's still a fair bit of work that needs to be done, I think, in terms of fine tuning how much volume should we be taking out in some of these partial cutting treatments or their orientation or configuration. There's a lot of work to be done there to optimize how we conduct some of these partial cutting treatments. And in fact, I think some of this work has been or currently being done in a second version of the Nova Scotia Silvicultural Guide to the Ecological Matrix that I believe it's in the works, or it hasn't been released to the public yet, but I'm looking forward to seeing it. Another thing that needs to be done is besides the fact that we know there's these silvicultural treatments that we need to do to emulate natural disturbances, the means by which we can do them currently is limited. And what I mean by that is to do many of these selection management or irregular shelterwood type treatments, it requires smaller, more nimble type machinery or other types of implementation tools. So here's an example, for instance, of what I mean. This is an example of a Malwa harvester that's being used to conduct some of these partial cutting treatments. The width of this machine here from track to track is only 195 centimeters, less than 2 meters. And so technologies like this now, they're enabling us to be able to go in and to conduct some of these partial cutting treatments more successfully than trying to do it with larger machinery that was set up for sustained yield clear cut harvesting. For instance, trying to do a commercial thinning or some of these selection management type treatments with a 30-ton harvester is not working so well. So there's more work that needs to be put into the sector itself, investing into this, and then not only investing in the machinery, but also in the training of individuals to use these tools correctly. Lastly, I talked about how currently the way we manage our forests in terms of cutting rates of high severity disturbance is out of whack with the natural disturbance rates. So obviously there's work to be done here in terms of, well, how can we better use our natural disturbance, what we know about natural disturbances, to help guide and nudge this in a bit of a different direction. In fact, a couple of years ago in 2022, we published a paper just on this very topic where we've introduced a strategy, sort of a methodology for how to take that natural disturbance regime information and to use it to help better guide the way we manage our forest and through forest management in terms of the where and when and how much cutting we do in different places. So some work has been done in this regard, and currently what we're working on now, though, is taking that model, that strategy that we've developed, and using a sophisticated landscape simulation model to try to enact or try to replicate some of these strategies that we developed in theory to see how well they can work. And so there's a lot of work that still needs to be done here to better figure out how can we implement or integrate what we know about natural disturbance into forest management planning. And then lastly, besides doing this and understanding the ecological consequences of this, there needs to be more work done on, well, what are the economic effects of doing this? If we're to implement ecological forestry more fully, more broadly, what are the economic effects? And so this is quite an in-depth and broad question that is very multifaceted and looks at a lot of different things besides timber. And so represents a major area of study. And in fact, this past winter, I myself here in my lab, in cooperation with the Ecological Forestry Initiative at Dalhousie University, we've created a position that we're currently hiring for, a PhD position, which is going to specifically tackle this question. If you were to implement ecological forestry more broadly across the region, how will it impact not just ecology, but the economics of the region? So I'd say there's much work to be done in its implementation, but very exciting times ahead in terms of what the potential of ecological forestry and what it can mean for us here in the Wabanaki Forest. So I want to thank you for your time today, and I'd be happy to take any questions.